Hello Year 12. So welcome to our revision on social influence. So this session is going to be on that tricky half. So we're going to work our way through 4 key topics for our revision. So topic 1, explanations of obedience. Topic 2, resistance to social influence. Topic 3, minority influence. And the 4th topic there, social change. So starting with topic 1, explanations of obedience, we need to know 3 key factors. So there are 3 separate explanations for why people will obey. So remember, before this section, you will have revised Milgram and have understood all of the research into obedience. And of course, from Milgram's research, the findings clearly demonstrate that people are very likely to obey even an unjust authority, as in his experiment. So the 3 factors are situational, social, psychological, and thirdly, dispositional factors. So let's take a look at the first one. So situational factors of obedience. So as I go through this with you, what I would like you to do is to think about the questions in front of you and whether you feel you can respond to them. So do you know the answers to these questions? So let's think first about which researcher's work is this based upon. So thinking about the area of obedience, the first person that should really jump into your head is, of course, that work by Milgram. And what's really key about Milgram's work is the fact that he noticed 65% of those participants that took part in the electric shock study were fully obedient. They went all the way to that potentially lethal 450 volt shock. So it's no wonder Milgram stepped back, thought about what happened, because if you remember, when he originally conducted the study, he didn't think any more than perhaps 1 to 3% of the population would actually obey that far. So it's no wonder then that Milgram takes this research and thinks, is there something else that I can do or change, such as the situation a person finds themselves in, and would this show an increase or a decrease in those obedience levels? So there are 3 situational factors of obedience. What are those 3 situational factors that perhaps would either increase or decrease? So just think for a moment, what are those? Firstly, we have location. So Milgram decided to change the location from his original. The original one took place in a university, and we know that this is very much a prestigious university, so it's well recognised for the work and the research. What about if we change that location? So in one of Milgram's variations, he simply took his study to an office block, so completely out of the environment of perhaps where we might see a psychological experiment being carried out. Obedience here falls to 47.5%, so quite a drop from his original 65. Proximity refers to the closeness between the person giving the instructions and the person who's receiving those instructions. It could also be the closeness or the distance between the person who's given the instructions and the person to whom they have to carry it out upon. So in one of our proximity conditions, we see Milgram gives instructions from the researcher over the phone to the teachers to administer the shocks. And here we see obedience again falls dramatically from 65% to just 20.5%. Uniform is our 3rd situational factor. Again, we can change how much of an authority figure an individual may appear to be. So in Milgram's original, we know that it's a researcher who's conducting it, and he does wear a lab coat. So again, this gives the impression that the study is being carried out very scientifically. So what happens if we change it from being a lab coat and a researcher to simply a normal civilian in normal clothes? So again, here we see that obedience drops to 20%. So thinking about exam questions, it's really good to try and check your understanding and to understand what a question is really asking from you. So let's take a little look at this one and have a think to yourself as you go through what you may put as your answer. So the question says, when you are a passenger on a train, you are much more likely to move to another seat if the ticket collector tells you to move than if another passenger tells you to do so. Use your knowledge of why people obey to explain this behaviour. So thinking about what I could use, notice how many marks are available. There are 4 marks available here. So as a rule of thumb, you should be writing 4 separate sentences. So 4 explanatory points and linking them back to the scenario, because this is what we call an assessment objective 2, an application of your knowledge. So thinking about the situational factors that we've just looked at, you could use them. So thinking about uniform, we could apply uniform firstly and explain how this is a situational factor and talk through some of those research findings. So what is meant by uniform? So here the ticket collector obviously wears a uniform, and this of course would encourage more people or influence them to perhaps be more obedient. Here's a really good place as well just to put in the research findings of Bickman. So in Bickman's study, he noticed that individuals were more likely to obey the orders of a security guard in comparison to a milkman, in comparison to a normal individual who was just wearing a jacket and tie. So this is really important, and we can explain that in the context then of our ticket collector. For 4 marks, it's a good idea to bring in a second example as well. So here we're just going to bring in proximity. And again, explain what the concept of proximity is. And of course, the fact is, with regards to this scenario, we expect to see a ticket collector on board a train. And then link to research. So to get that 4th point and to really get a good answer in here, talk about the fact, you know, the ticket collector is present. If someone wasn't present, then perhaps our obedience would fall. So if there is no ticket collector around, okay, then and an ordinary person perhaps asks you, you perhaps wouldn't necessarily do this. So a straightforward question just asking you about factors. So here we've got identify 2 factors that have been shown to affect obedience to authority. Briefly discuss how each of these factors affects obedience to authority. So here the focus is on 2 factors, and very similar to the question we have done beforehand, we do not need to apply to any scenario, but simply give some research, okay, to fully get those marks. So again, if we break it down, I could use uniform as one of my factors, explaining it's a situational factor, outline what is meant by having a uniform, how does it have an effect, the fact that different types of uniforms may create different responses in individuals. And again, you could link to either Milgram's variational findings or Bickman's study. So to use something a little bit different, let's also go for location. So location, what do we actually mean by that? So where the orders are given. If it's perhaps a prestigious university, we're more likely to get higher obedience levels as in Milgram's study. But if I was given the same instructions outside of that experimental context in a rundown office block, I'm less likely to follow the orders that were given in Milgram's experiment. And again, pop some findings in there to really boost those 6 marks, okay, to encourage those higher mark boundaries. So again, you can see here 6 bullet points, 6 marks. You could be asked just about one of these areas. So again, think about how many marks are available. So proximity and how it affects obedience. 4 marks, define what it is. Outline Milgram's original findings of the 65%, okay, when the experimenter is in the same room as our teacher. And then discuss both of the variations. Proximity, we have 2 variations that we have learnt. So there is the touch proximity, where they have to administer the electric shock themselves as the teacher to the learner. and also variation 2, where the researcher simply gives the instructions over the phone. So again, quite a drop from the original 65%. So thinking about in terms of evaluation, if we think about general evaluation points that we can use and those that are going to really boost and encourage marks, it's always a great idea to have that research evidence present. So using your Peel structure, see if you can also perhaps expand some of these points in your head as we go through them. So the first one is the research evidence that we've already discussed with Bickman. So orders such as picking up that litter and put it in the bin. Participants were twice as likely to do that if a guard had asked them, in comparison to a milkman or a normal civilian who's wearing a jacket and tie. The other thing about the research into situational factors is of course the controlled methodology. Milgram used a laboratory experiment, and it's been able to be replicated numerous times. Think about all the different variations he's done, the manipulation of the IV each time. So he really focused in on whether it was the location he changed or the proximity he's changed. But expanding that point further, think about the fact that we know this study has also been replicated in numerous countries and cultures. So that's a really good thing about this piece of research. Looking at a weakness, it does lack a little bit of that internal validity, that trustworthiness. Does it truly measure those levels of obedience? And when we put it in context to the variations and the situational factors, it has been argued that demand characteristics were very probable. So demand characteristics, if you recall, means that perhaps our participants guess the aim or change their behaviour in order to please our researcher. So one of the examples could be in that change of individual who was used. So using an ordinary person instead of a researcher, perhaps many people would have thought, well, this isn't quite right, if you think in context of what they're being asked to do, to administer electric shock. And finally, for a fourth evaluation point, which would be needed if we have a 16 marker, which is purely on situational factors, don't forget the classic. All of this research links in and is practically applied to Nazi Germany. So we've got that obedience alibi. Under different situations, people do act differently. We know that, we can see that from the research. But this evidence is still not good enough to use as an excuse or a defence for those individuals who took part in the atrocities of the Holocaust. So moving on to our second factor, which helps us to explain why people obey. So this is social psychological factors. I want you to kind of think about this in terms of these are things that we have created and learned through society, and then they affect how we behave and think when we're put in that situation to obey. So what are those two social psychological factors that you need to have a good awareness about? Well, the first factor is the agentic state, and the second one is legitimacy of authority figure. Now, please remember that both of these do go hand in hand. So again, based on Milgram's research, Milgram wants to find further explanations as to why people are so willing to obey an unjust authority. And so he creates the agentic theory. So looking at that question, which of the following statements best describes the agentic state? Hopefully, many of you have decided to go for D. So the agentic state is where people no longer feel responsible for their actions as they are acting for an authority figure. So be aware, there are lovely questions like this as well that can be put onto the exam paper. So worth 1 mark, read very carefully, double check the question before you answer. So thinking there about the probable questions, But let's just go for a straightforward outline what is meant by the agentic state. So there's key things to talk about here. We know that it was proposed by Milgram, so include that. So after his research, this theory was created by Milgram to help further explain his findings. So question 1, what is the agentic state? We've just seen from the previous question that this is acting as an agent to another person who gives you instructions. So in the case of Milgram's original, those individuals that carried on and certainly past the 300 volts where they could no longer hear our learner, they perhaps go into this agentic state. They're following the orders, okay, that have been given to them by the perceived authority figure, okay, our researcher in the lab coat. However, there's a second state that we are also in, and this is the autonomous state. So most of us are in an autonomous state most of the time, and this is where we feel free to act according to our own conscience. So those that perhaps decided after 300 volts, when they could no longer hear the learner, despite being prodded, felt it wasn't right for them to do, and so they left the experiment. So question 3 there suggests, what did Milgram mean by this agentic shift? So we're moving from that autonomous state into the agentic state. But what does Milgram actually mean? So it is literally going from you being in control of yourself and your own conscious into that agentic state and following orders, because you do actually perceive the other person to be some kind of authority figure. Fourth point that's often missed out is that fourth question there. What are binding factors? And these are key, and try and explain them in your answer. So these are what actually allow the individual to ignore the damaging effects. Okay, so they create moral strain of their obedient behaviour. Milgram did suggest that some individuals reduce this anxiety by denying the damage or blaming the victim in some way. So a binding factor is what is binding you to that authority figure. Although it's causing moral strain, and that's vital, okay, because if you think about in Milgram's experiment, they know that this is uneasy to give someone else an electric shock, particularly because they're no longer responding in the room. They're feeling that moral strain, they're feeling that anxiety. Think back to the video you watched, okay, some people were sweating, some were nervous, some of them were shaking, but they still continue to administer the shocks. So to cope with that, and to reduce that anxiety, many of them perhaps were denying the amount of damage they were perhaps really doing, or they could be blaming the learner in some way, or our victim. And you only have to think about how perhaps the Nazi soldiers followed the instructions as to how we can understand how that moral strain and denying that responsibility or blaming the Jews in some way causes that shift. So as part of our evaluation, again, research evidence, okay, so Blass-Smith found that people blame the legitimate authority figure for the participants' behaviour. So here they showed the video of Milgram's original experiment to a number of individuals, and having watched the Milgram experiment for the first time and not knowing any background, the individuals that watched this video did indeed suggest that it wasn't the participants that are to blame for the behaviour, but actually it was the researcher. So again, suggesting this idea that they had merely gone into the agentic state and they weren't to blame. Limitations, however, of the agentic state, it is limited. If we think about the idea of an agentic state and an autonomous state, it's really difficult to test the theory and to identify which state someone actually truly is in at any one time. Secondly, if we bring in the nurses study by Hoffling, 21 out of our 22 nurses went to administer an unknown drug at twice the dosage, yet none of them showed that moral strain. But moral strain is important, okay? It's an important concept of moving into the agentic state. Also, similarly to our previous points, it cannot account for all of the behaviour that we see in Nazi Germany. If we take the German Reserve Battalion 101, here many of the individuals chose to shoot civilians even though they weren't given that order directly. They had an option. So let's move on to our second explanation here, so our social psychological explanation. And again, a question maybe worth 4 marks. What sorts of things should we be putting in here? So I think it's really important to, first of all, actually explain very clearly what we mean by legitimacy of authority. Many students rush their answer and also sometimes fail to mention everything that's necessary. So what does this mean? Firstly, who we perceive to be an authority figure is created through that hierarchical structure that we have, the nature we have in society. Please remember, it isn't just about what someone wears and their uniform. So typically individuals will obey those who are perceived to be towards more of the top of that hierarchy, in positions of moral authority, managers and bosses, heads of schools. And most of us accept that authority figures should exercise power over others. And sometimes that also includes that they have the power not only to reward us, but they can punish us as well. And what seems to happen is that we quite readily hand over control to the individual because we trust them. We trust that they know what they're doing. And that's because we've been brought up and socialised to understand that hierarchical structure. So similarly, we are more likely to obey our parents or perhaps older people. So age could be a factor. Don't forget, not all obedience is good. We've seen that through Milgram's research, but also in history. So don't forget to make that link. Put that in there. So question 2, name a charismatic leader who used their legitimate powers for destructive purposes. And of course, Hitler will spring to mind. So it's fine to also just mention that in there, that legitimacy authority can also mean that we are more likely to follow orders of someone who is also destructive in nature. So going through the evaluation, lots of practical application here. In particular here, we can see that it can help us to understand cultural differences. So in different countries and cultures, who they perhaps perceive as an authority figure changes. So if we conduct Milgram's study out in Australia, we only have a 16% obedience rate. Again, thinking about Nazi war criminals, it can't be used as a good enough defence, okay, simply following the instructions of somebody else. And of course, we've seen some real life occurrences. So the sad My Lai massacre in Vietnam War, with the US Army believing that they were more powerful and had more authority and control and were higher up that hierarchy, and therefore caused the atrocities of killing, raping, pillaging innocent civilians. So our third factor that helps us to explain why people will obey is one of your favourites, and it's the dispositional factors of obedience. So this is based on Adorno's authoritarian personality. So Adorno, very similar to other researchers such as Milgram, was very much interested in understanding the atrocities of Nazi Germany, and was concerned that perhaps there were characteristics or certain individuals that were led to be more authoritative and more destructive in their ways. So to set about testing this, Adorno created the F scale. So question 1, how was it investigated? So you can briefly talk about the fact that he created this fascist scale, the F scale, which literally was used to study unconscious attitudes towards other groups. And he believed that those who do not question destructive authority perhaps have some sort of pathological disorder, and it's rooted in our personality. So some of you might recall from our lessons, you sat down and you actually completed the F scale, and there were some questions on there. And there are certainly attitudes that we perhaps hold towards certain groups of individuals. So it's done in such a way to record those unconscious attitudes. Now, thinking about the participants, this is also crucial because this will enable us to already think evaluation points. So the participants that we used were 2,000 middle-class white American men. So already population validity, generalizability, we can truly question this. This is just one group of individuals. But what's interesting is the findings. So Adorno has suggested that there is an authoritarian personality, and it is those that will score very high on his scale. He says it's linked to them having a very strong and fixed cognitive, so thinking style. So they have fixed views and stereotypes about groups and people. And they are conscious of knowing other people's status as well. So we've got to kind of think already that if these are his findings, then somewhere in our description, which we'll move on to in a moment, what's the cause of all of this? Okay, they're scoring highly on the F scale, they've got strong views, strong cognitive styles, but if it's part of our personality, where does that actually come from? So the cause of developing this personality type. Just take a quick look as well at question 5, just to really get you thinking. We're going to link into one of my favourite approaches here, which is the psychodynamic approach. So if we're talking about an individual here, we're talking about their personality development, what sorts of things can you remember are some of those key assumptions from the psychodynamic approach? And so when you think about some of those key assumptions, the unconscious drives and early childhood experiences determining our adult behaviour, it's no wonder then that the cause has been proposed to be something that happens during our childhood. And in particular, the personality is developed because that individual has had a very harsh and punitive, so punishing parenting style. So perhaps there is regimented and strict discipline within the household. You've got to remember this is 1950s and going before the 1950s. It perhaps is very, very different, very much disciplined families, the way in which they did things. So another key thing to remember is that there was perhaps very much conditional love with these individuals. So the parents only showed their love and respect for their children depending upon whether or not the children behaved in a way in which was desired by those parents. So thinking in terms of Freud and for question 5, how does this fit in? Why is it that these individuals, they've had this harsh and punitive upbringing, it's shaping their personality, but how does this actually help us to explain why they're more likely to be obedient? Well, through this strict upbringing, they recognise who they should be obeying, and they've developed their own stereotypes and their own views. So during that time of being punished themselves and not being able to express how they feel, it actually creates inside them, if you think about defense mechanisms, a little bit of resentment and hostility. These are children and young individuals that cannot express how they truly feel to their parents because they are fearful they'll be punished and rejected. So instead, those feelings kind of bottle up inside, okay, by that defense mechanism, and then they are later displaced onto individuals that are perceived as weaker in that hierarchy, okay, or in that social structure, okay. So they are what they would perhaps say as socially inferior. And if you think about Hitler, when we watched that lovely video, the idea that actually Hitler himself had a really troublesome childhood, and so could go some way to explaining why he was the way he was. So try and link in your answers when talking about dispositional factors. Talk a little bit about how it was designed by Adorno to measure this personality type. Where does this personality type come from? What are some of those key traits? And please don't forget to mention the psychodynamic aspect in there. Okay, so the idea that we are repressing those feelings and we're going to displace those onto other individuals. So if someone gives us an order to be destructive and we have those pent-up hostile feelings, we're more likely to be destructive and project these feelings on to other people. So thinking in terms of evaluation, don't forget there's plenty of research to support. So you've got Milgram's obedient participants were shown to also have this personality type. It is, again, a limited explanation. Surely not everybody who was in the the Nazi Germany army would have had this personality trait. There is some suggestion that maybe the SS soldiers had slightly more of an authoritarian personality, but it's very difficult to suggest that everybody who took part in the atrocities had an authoritarian personality. Also think about all the methodological issues. Adorno's created a questionnaire, the F scale. What we do know is that all the questions were kind of worded in one way. So if someone was just simply just tick, 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 all of them in one column, it would change their scoring. Also consider the idea that this is correlational. So correlations just show us a relationship. They do not demonstrate cause and effect like an experiment would do. So what Adorno is suggesting is that harsh upbringing is in some way linked as well to that high score on the F scale, which ultimately is going to lead to someone who's going to be more obedient. So think that parents surely in their upbringing can't necessarily just be the only reason for why someone might develop, let's say, the authoritarian personality. If you look back at your notes, we also talked about things like their education. So at home, parents might suggest certain ways of thinking and certain prejudice and stereotype viewpoints, but also this could be exaggerated even further within the poor educational system. We're fortunate that today in education, we teach about issues such as prejudice and equal opportunities and equal rights. So we try to encourage individuals not to have those stereotypical views. Whereas if we think about Nazi Germany, schools were very much encouraged to have certain views. And also we talked earlier about who was used in the study. So think about population validity, who was used to create the F scale, who answered the F scale questions, all white Americans. So again, there's huge issues here with making generalizations from them to everybody else. Okay, so that was topic 1. Topic 2, we're going to go through resistance to social influence. So here we are going to look at social support and your favourite locus of control. So social support, keep it nice and simple. Think about questions such as what is meant by the term social support. And to help you to do this, break it down into the 2 areas. So if we're looking at why people resist social influence has consisted of us learning about conformity and obedience. So we're going to get our 4 marks this way. So with conformity, we know that we are less likely to go along with others in the presence of someone else who also goes against the group. So think here, who was our key researcher for conformity? Think back to some videos that we've watched. And as you're thinking about that, also then consider the second part of obedience. So just having some support from somebody else may actually stop us following orders from someone, so from an individual. So if there is someone else who is a disobedient peer who suggests that or says that they don't want to follow out an order, then we may also follow that because they make us feel more comfortable to refuse that order. So with regards to conformity, if you remember Ash's 3-lined matching experiment, which clearly looked at the idea of normative social influence, so this idea that those true participants gave the incorrect or a different answer to the one they wished to give because they wanted to fit in with the group. But what about if someone else along the line gives a different answer? Well, this also, we saw, reduces the pressure for our true participant to give the wrong answer and encourages them to give the correct answer. So having someone else that goes against the group and against that group norm encourages us to also do what we would rather do. Thinking about that obedience, our research, of course, comes from Milgram. And we're going to have a look here at the condition where another participant who's sharing the role of being a teacher, so they were paired, refuses to continue. And so at this point, if our true participant is paired with another teacher and that teacher refuses to continue and give electric shocks, then our true participant also refuses to continue, okay, and in 90% of those cases. So that just goes to show that if someone else is willing to say, actually, no, I don't want to do that, I feel uncomfortable with that, if we're feeling the same way, it's kind of like, oh, goodness for that, I don't want to continue either. So that's your 4 marks. Link it into conformity and where social support comes from for conformity. Give an example from Ash, then move on 3rd mark, where it comes from the social support in obedience. What does that mean? So if someone else doesn't want to follow orders, it means you're less likely to. And again, link that into a variation that we've seen in Milgram. So when it comes to evaluate, lots of research evidence. The evidence here is very similar to the Ash experiment, but instead we've got someone who also gives a different answer, but they have bad eyesight. And you might remember reading it and they've got very thick lens glasses. So even though we might question whether they can see properly themselves, it doesn't matter. Just because they've said something different makes us feel comfortable as well to also say maybe an answer that goes against the majority in that room. There's also research to support the obedience. So we can see that obedience drops when we have that disobedient role model, okay, when they're present. You might recall the study of Gamson, where a group of individuals at an oil factory refused to give evidence when instructed to do so because it was wrong. So they actually rebelled against giving that false evidence. It's also very much culturally bound research, okay, so we have to question, when we look at all of this, would it still be the same in different countries and different cultures? So perhaps the fact that this research primarily has been done in America, would we find similar results if we use these dissenters, etc., in other cultures? Okay, so your favourite locus of control. So let's go through it nice and slowly and nice and clearly. So again, thinking about if we were to be asked a question, 4 marks, or if you had to put locus of control into a 16 marker, you would still need a good 3 to 4 points if it went alongside social support. So think first of all, what is it? And I think for most of you, it's a difficult thing to define. Yes, you can tell me about high internals. Yes, you can tell me about high externals, but what actually is a locus of control? So here's a nice little definition for you. Think of it in terms of a trait. It's a trait that you have within you that acts as your kind of sense. Okay, it senses what we would perceive as to the thing that directs events in our lives. So it was originally proposed and researched by Rotter. And people actually differ in that sense. So what they believe directs the events and outcomes in their life. So it does help to explain people's successes and failures, but remember, it works on a continuum. So I've got high internals at one end and I've got high externals at the other end. And what we're really interested in is those that really score high on either end of that continuum. Most of us, if we carry out a locus of control inventory, we will fall somewhere in between, usually as more of an internal locus of control, but not necessarily at the right extremes. So what do these traits tell us about individuals? So if we think about traits of high internals, they know that they have control over the events in their lives. So they know, for example, if they do good or badly in an exam, it's down to them. It depends on the work and the effort that they had put in. So actually they are going to be less likely to be socially influenced by others around them. So if they don't want to take part in something, they're not going to. If they don't want to follow the orders that someone's given because they don't like them, they're not going to. So high internals are often very much leaders that we see. They've got high levels of confidence in their own ability and put their achievements down to themselves. So then we've got the other extreme, we've got the high externals. So people who are high in this external locus of control actually don't think they have much control of their life. It might simply be due to things like fate. So if they fail an exam, it's because they've had a bad teacher, or it was just the luck of the questions that appeared on the day. So they are going to be very highly socially influenced. They're going to be easily persuaded, so they're more likely to conform with individuals and are more likely to obey orders without questioning them. So they kind of follow people a lot. So thinking about evaluation, lots of research to support here as well. We noticed that if we go back to Milgram's types of research and his procedures, that people who have or score higher on internal locus of control were less likely to actually continue in Milgram's study because it got to a point and they're in control. Now here's an extra piece of research for you as well. So we've got Spector in 1983, and they used Rotter's locus of control scale to determine whether locus of control is associated with conformity. And from 157 students, Spector found that individuals with a high internal locus of control were less likely to conform than those who had a high external locus of control, but only in situations of normative social influence where individuals conform because they want to be accepted and liked. There was no difference between the two groups for informational social influence. So this actually suggests that normative social influence, the desire to fit in and to be liked, is actually a more powerful than informational social influence, the desire to be right, when we actually consider the impact of our locus of control. So external locus of control individuals want to conform more to be liked rather than that desire to be right. There's also contradictory evidence. As times have changed, we actually are noticing that people are becoming more external yet more disobedient. So it doesn't seem to perhaps add up. So we can question the theory now. Maybe it needs to be re-looked at in terms of today's society. Many of us are more influenced by social media. So perhaps there are further avenues of research. And of course, it's really difficult to understand and explain a trait like locus of control, to be able to explain all types of social influences from conformity and obedience. It's been suggested that it may have a limited role and that our locus of control actually only has an impact on our decisions when it's a new situation to us rather than a familiar one. So quick check your understanding question. Have a go at doing this. You can pause this if you want to have a go at answering it before you look at the answers. So Daniel and Matthew are in the same class at school, but have very different views on success. Daniel is convinced that success is due to hard work and determination, whilst Matthew believes that luck and fate determine success. The class is putting on a play, and neither Daniel nor Matthew wants to participate. Their friends are trying to persuade them to take part. Question A. Using your knowledge of locus of control, identify which boy is most likely to resist the social influence and explain why. So look at that question, 4 marks, using your knowledge. First thing, identify which boy. Explain why. So simply identifying the boy, saying which type of locus of control is already 2 marks, and then explain what it is about that particular locus of control. Another boy in the class, Tom, refuses to take part in the play. Explain how Tom's refusal to take part might affect Daniel's and Matthew's ability to resist social influence. So now we're flicking to the other theory that we've learned, so social support. So think how you could explain that. Have a go at answering this question yourself, and then on the next slide are the answers. So here are your answers. You can have a little look through these, perhaps mark your own answer if you have produced one, and you can clearly see where all the marks are coming from. Don't forget, you can also include research evidence to help in your explanation for part A. So topic 3, minority influence. So again, ask yourself, what is minority influence? So this refers to how one person or a small group influences the beliefs, behaviours and attitudes of a larger group of people. See if you can remember the 3 processes that we identified in class as well. So just have a little think about those. And also what type of compliance this would lead to if you were to be influenced by minority influence. So think even further back, even to compliance. So the big thing about minority influence is, because I'm changing the views and attitudes of other people, I'm hoping that these attitudes will be changed permanently. So it's quite nice to mention in here that it is linked to internalization. That idea that I've internalized it, so I'm always going to carry on with that belief and act that belief out. So both my public and private views will change. And how are they changed? How does it become internalized? Well, there are 3 to 4 key processes. Remember, a minority needs to be consistent in their views. So they make people rethink their current views. They are consistent by challenging and giving the new views and beliefs and opinions. And this starts to get them to think about it, thinking about their current views. So they're cognitively processing. Commitment, really important. A minority needs to show that commitment in order to gain people's trust and to get their attention. This can be done through some extreme activities. So if you think about, we came across the term augmentation principle, putting yourself and your reputation on the line. If you think about the suffragette movement and the Emilys and how they put themselves at risk, some of those women even starving themselves, chaining themselves up just to make that statement. Even more recently with Jamie Oliver and his views on healthy eating and changing schools, his whole reputation was put on the line whilst he was filming those. And of course, really important is that idea that yes, you've got to be consistent, yes, you've got to be committed, but you've also got to show flexibility. So you can't be too rigid in your views and not listen to others. Listening to other people's views and ideas is really important, and balance up those views. But ultimately, you still come back to your argument. So you're not just, yeah, this is what I think and that's it. You listen to other people and go, oh, yes, I can see your point of view. However, so it's that flexibility, and it really helps to encourage to bring people onto your side because they're going to listen to you. And it's very hard to get people to listen to a minority. So the other thing that then happens is that 4th process, which is the snowball effect. And so gradually over time, just like a snowball, it will build in size and momentum, and more people become converted to that new view. People will go off and talk to other people about it and spread those beliefs and those behaviours. So looking at minority influence, our key study was Moscovici in 1969. The procedure in Moscovici's study, there were 6 people who viewed a set of 36 slides. All of the slides were bluey greeny in colour. There were 2 Confederates amongst those 6 participants, and there were 3 key conditions. So in condition 1, the Confederates, so those 2 individuals, report that all the slides are green. In condition 2, our Confederates are inconsistent. So sometimes they'll say blue, sometimes they'll say green. So they're very inconsistent in their answering. And condition 3 is simply a control. There's no Confederates. It's 6 true participants shown the 36 slides, and we just see how they answer. So the findings and conclusions demonstrate a lot about minority influence. If we look at those that were in condition 1, the results show that participants gave the same wrong answer on 8.4% of trials, or at least that means that 32% of all of our participants gave the same incorrect answer as the Confederates in at least one trial. So they were influenced. And this is quite strong. It then drops in condition 2. Because our Confederates are inconsistent, this allows also for our true participants not to feel as if they're being persuaded or need to change their views. They're more likely to give their own opinion. And of course, in condition 3, where there's no influence, they gave the wrong answer on just 0.25%. So it does show, although it's quite a small percentage, it still is significant in terms of what we're looking at. This is a minority trying to influence a majority. And it's a really difficult thing to do and to study. So again, just a quick question. So Jenny is a psychology teacher who works with 6 other teachers in the department. Jenny believes strongly that homework should not be graded as it distracts students from reading verbal feedback on their work. She would like her colleagues to stop grading work. The other members of the department do not agree, but have told Jenny that they are willing to have a meeting about it. So use your knowledge of minority influence and explain how Jenny might be able to persuade the rest of the department. So we've got 6 marks. So again, try and work your way through as many of the processes as possible. So explaining that she should have consistency, link back to the scenario. She should demonstrate that commitment, okay, by maybe placing herself at some risk or inconvenience, that she's welcoming emails or holding seminars for parents and students. And of course, this will draw more attention to her cause, and she's putting herself and her reputation on the line. She needs to show flexibility. So of course she's going to listen to other people, okay, and accept valid counter arguments from her colleagues and the parents and students. And she might ultimately suggest that there's a little bit of both, that perhaps not everything needs to be ungraded, and a few things like, you know, mock exams could be graded. And then over time, gradually, maybe we might see that snowball effect, and more people, if it's noticed that it works, will perhaps also be converted to do this. So working your way through those 4, describing them is going to get you that 4 marks, but obviously applying that then back to Jenny in the scenario is where you're going to hit the full 6 marks. And of course, any other valid points. So if you've still got some time and you've only completed this in 4 minutes, think I've still got a couple of minutes left, maybe you could include some more things that we know, okay, about maybe the confidence levels, or the idea that eventually, if this is taken on board by the whole school in a few years' time, social cryptoamnesia might occur, which is where individuals no longer know where it came from in the first place, that it was actually Jenny who started it. So minority influence evaluation. Think about all the research, lots of it. Moscovici's research clearly showed consistency, and it's been backed up by the meta-analysis by Wood et al. So a number of these studies have been conducted, and they all share the results of Moscovici's original study. Also, it has shown that there is this depth of thought. Because we're being influenced by a minority, there are longer effects we deeply process, and we're more likely to take on the beliefs and values of a minority. Be aware though, with studies like Moscovici and Nemeth, who we've come across, who's done very similar research, they are all artificial. Blue, green slides, not really an everyday task, so it lacks some of those limited, you know, those keyword applications. And also the research has good support for that idea, as we say, about the internalisation and linking back to compliance. And Moscovici did another little variation where even when participants write their answers down separately, so they don't say them out loud, they still internalised and would agree with the minority views on that consistent condition. And don't forget, you've always got the practical applications. We've seen minority influence at work, e.g. the suffragette movement, and you can easily talk through that as well, how that works. So our last topic, social change. So again, thinking about social change is kind of a bit synoptic, if you like, of everything we've done in social influence. So social change is going to comprise of the 3 areas that we've studied. Social change is the way in which society, rather than just an individual, develops over time, and how we replace the beliefs, attitudes and behaviours with new ones. So the 3 areas, of course, are conformity, obedience and minority influence. So with regards to social change, what are some of the lessons that we've learned from conformity research? So if we take our minds back to Ash and the ideas of normative social influence, so wanting to fit in and be liked, and an informational social influence, a desire to be right and to seek the right information, use that. So we are going to be drawn to wanting to conform if that's what other people are doing, if that's what's deemed as the right thing to do. So in terms of helping people to come about and do this social change, think along the lines of creating posters and positive campaigns that individuals will get on board with, sticking up posters, sticking notices on bins to recycle, will really encourage. And if they think that other people are doing that, then we want to do that as well. When we think in terms of obedience and research evidence from Milgram and some of his variations and what's been shown, there are also other key indicators of how obedience can help us with regards to bringing about a social change. Sometimes in our society, we obey because we feel that is the right thing to do and we don't want to cause trouble. But disobedient role models can encourage others to change their beliefs if they also believe that it's wrong. So others will stop following instructions of an authority figure because others have also refused to follow. So think back to that Milgram's participants who refused to continue and give electric shocks when the other individual, the other teacher, also said that. Putting that in context, think about the views and the historical changes with views towards homosexuality and the many changes we've seen in society. At one stage, homosexuality was deemed to be a psychological disorder. It was in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It was really frowned upon, shamed upon, and now it's completely different views and values. So we can reject sometimes what individuals are saying or what people perhaps are suggesting is the norm, and we have to change society. We have to change with the times. Secondly, I want to bring in the idea of gradual commitment. People are more likely to change if it's a gradual thing. And if we're asked to do one thing and we do that, then we're more likely to do another thing. So if one small instruction is obeyed, this gives way to other instructions being obeyed. So even if those instructions go against our own approval, so again, think in terms of Milgram, very cleverly, gradual commitment, 15-volt increments. You've somehow gone from a 45-volt all the way to a potentially deadly 450 volt, simply because it's minimal, okay, minimal increases. Also think in terms here, I'm just going to bring in Zimbardo. You've watched the video, you've seen it, we've understood it. Think about those prison guards and the instructions they were giving to the prisoners, and how over time and over that space of 5 days, some of the things the prison guards were asking the prisoners to do increased in intensity, and yet the prisoners carried out those instructions. So thinking about minority, what are the lessons learned? In your textbook, there are these 6 key things that you can talk your way through. We want people to pay attention to what it is, draw their attention to the changes that we want to bring about. I need to be consistent. I need people to get processing it deep and cognitively thinking about it to change their views. I need to show that I'm truly committed and put myself on the line. I need the snowball effect to happen. And ultimately, I know the job is done when social cryptoamnesia happens. So people forget where it came from in the first place. However, for ease, in the exam, stick with what we know, stick with those 4 key things, and just link it into an example that we have learned through history, such as the suffragette movement. If you're going to get asked a 6 marker on explaining social change, the chances are you'll be able to bring in not only minority influence, but you should be bringing in something from conformity or obedience. If you limit yourself to just minority influence, it's unlikely you're going to score the full 6 marks. So here, using an example, explain the role of social influence processes in social change, 6 marks. So here you can just see that I've given a little answer of the possible context that you could just talk through, so the different things in there. So you don't have to always limit yourself to minority influence. You can also talk through in here other things that have happened. But if the question just focuses on minority influence, then by all means, you have enough in here to get credit. It's always really important as well to bring in research if you can, and use examples from history as well. And here's an application question. AQA like to use these, particularly for social influence. So here's a question about views and how Britain's views have changed on homosexuality. And the question simply asks you, with reference to the article, explain how social influence leads to social change. So you'll see, just by having a look through what you could actually use, you will see the factors from minority influence, that consistency, commitment and flexibility, link it back in, okay, that people have been consistent, committed, flexible in their views, how social change has, how minorities helped us to change those, the gay right campaigners, people that have challenged that majority viewpoint, particularly it being a psychological disorder. And don't forget, you've got the theory there to conformity and the idea that people want new information. Okay, people want to be informed more about it. Lots of people don't really understand things and issues such as homosexuality. So they need that information to be able to understand it fuller, to make their judgment and their own correct opinion and be able to internalize those ideas. And of course, obedience, well, by people going against these old-fashioned views about homosexuality, it allows for changes to be made in the law because people are no longer happy with it. And so we see that gradual change. And so, of course, that snowball effect occurs. And finally, we kind of forget things, the social crypto amnesia, where it came from originally, or even the fact that perhaps homosexuality at one point was seen as a mental illness and was highly frowned upon by society. So finally, social change, when it comes to evaluating, I think there's plenty of research support out there. Normative social influence, it is a very valid explanation for change. Think about some of the research we've looked at throughout the course, you know, giving posters to individuals or telling other people to reduce their energy consumption, okay, messages hung on doors or posted on bins, or posters hanging up at schools and colleges. All of these messages create an idea within individuals that, oh, if everybody else is doing that, I need to be doing that. Also, minority influence is perhaps only indirectly effective. It is a limitation. Perhaps minority influence is limited. Most people are influenced to things that are related to the central issue, but sometimes don't really want to fully commit to the issue itself. So if you think about things like smoking campaigns, it is a gradual thing. Minorities can only influence you one step at a time. They can't help to overcome the whole bigger issue. So if you think about things like the smoking campaigns, it's been a gradual thing, you know, so creating the laws of no smoking in public places, smoking outside, no longer advertising it, keeping cigarettes behind the counter, behind shutters, having the black packets, now making it illegal for people to smoke in a car with individuals that are under the age of 16. So all of these have been gradual things. So it's not an easy task for minority to go straight in there and get society to change the whole issue. It's got to be gradual. The deeper processing can also be questioned. So the idea that it leads to deeper processing and internalisation, well, it's questionable because most of us perhaps are influenced by a majority, and we don't want to be seen as going against a majority either. Okay, so it is something. So, for example, the next point there is suggesting that there are barriers to that social change. You know, lots of people might have certain beliefs that might fit in with the minority, but feel that they'll be also classed as a social deviant if they carry on and have the same views as the minority. So they simply carry on, if you like, complying with the majority. So publicly display one thing, but privately do think the same as minority, but perhaps are fearful of being seen as socially deviant. And of course, don't forget, there's methodological issues. So thinking about population validity, if you think about Moscovici's study as well, okay, for minority influence, we know that that was small scale, females. Most of these are based on things like the laboratory experiments, Ash, Milgram. Many of them are not true to real life. So you can also bring that in. So I hope that's been really helpful to you all in helping you to revise. I wish you luck in your revision and good luck on your assessment, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.